And we are rolling. Hi, Oscar.
Hi, how are you today?
Good. So I am Mark Goldberg with UN Dispatch, a blog about the UN and global affairs, and I'm speaking with.
Oscar Schlenker. I'm a video journalist based in Caracas, Venezuela.
All right. So we're talking about all the events in Venezuela. A lot to talk about. Before we do that, though, I have sort of just kind of a random question to ask you. I mean, I'm pretty good at geography, and I was informed. I had no idea that Venezuela is actually a half hour ahead of East Coast U.S. time. Although that doesn't seem to make much geographical sense to me. Do you know sort of like why that's the case?
Yeah, that law came into effect a few years back. Hugo Chavez, then president, he pushed back or pushed forward 30 minutes of our time zone, claiming that that would give children more time to sleep before they go to school. I think that was the claim
Huh.
they made to
Interesting.
change the time slot half an hour. So yeah, we're half an hour difference from any other
Trying
country.
to rope in the young voters to the Chavismo party. Interesting. So, obviously more serious, a lot going on in Venezuela. Protests erupted big time, what about like 10, 13 days ago? Can you, I guess, tell us sort of what motivates these protesters, who these protesters are, and sort of, offer some context as to sort of what's happening in Venezuela right now?
Sure. Well, the protest started soon after the first days of February in Táchira state. That's the state that borders Colombia on the western part of Venezuela. And students there began protesting because a fellow student was raped, or they tried to rape her. And they went out to protest, and then they were repressed by armed forces and detained. And that began all that sparked these protests nationwide.
So the
But the student.
just to back up for a second, the sort of the proximate cause sort of was that the sort of students were protesting rape, sexual violence on campus, and they were repressed. They were beaten back by the police, and this sort of blew into something bigger.
Well, yes,
Interesting.
that started this wave of protests. But the student movement has been protesting for a long time now. Last year, when Hugo Chavez went under surgery, and the people didn't know anything about him for months, the students, this student movement, they started protesting in front of the Cuban embassy, and actually slept there for a couple of weeks, holding protests and sit downs to have information about the president. And it's been difficult to pinpoint all of the causes of the protests, because in essence they're protesting the high crime rates that we're living. They're protesting that we can't find basic items on the shelves because of the high inflation that we have, and the economic restrictions that the system has implemented in Venezuela. So there are a lot of reasons and claims that this protest takes, especially from different groups of student movements. Um, but in essence, is that people are, or the opposition is quite tired of the system that is very restrictive on certain issues, especially the exchange rate, and the problems we have with crime.
And now, are the protests principally sort of located in Caracas, or is it like an urban protest movement? Are there protests in other cities throughout Venezuela, or even in sort of rural sectors? Is there sort of rural disgruntlement as well?
Yes, actually, in Caracas, they began a bit later, on the 12th of February, which was National Youth Day. That's when the armed forces really went after some of the protesters, and that's when the first three deaths occurred, and 66 wounded. And that intensified or radicalized a bit the protests. But before then, many cities in Venezuela had been protesting already. In Valencia, that's in the Carabobo state, Anzoátegui, that's another state in the flatlands or in the llanos or the eastern part of Venezuela. Um, there have been a lot of protests outside of Caracas. But when it reached Caracas, the repression became much more evident.
So I guess what do these protest? What are these protesters demanding? I guess short of the resignation of Nicolas Maduro, the current president. What sort of are their chief objectives? I suppose.
Well, the main objective is to free all the students that have been detained during these protests, and ultimately also to free the imprisonment of Leopoldo Lopez, who is a political figure that has risen a bit internationally. We knew him very well here in Venezuela, but internationally, his name has been coming up more often because he was or he handed himself into authorities after they made him responsible for the deaths of February 12th, and that's one of the main reasons that they're protesting. And also all the other reasons that I mentioned: the high inflation, the fact that we can't find basic need products in stores, and the high crime rates, and also the disarmament of these gangs that support the government that have been blamed for a lot of the violence that has been taking place in these protests by the
Now,
opposition.
so my impression, and I'm sort of not like a Latin Americanist, but my impression is at least sort of in the Chavez years that sort of while sort of he was not a careful steward of the Venezuelan economy, nor was he a paragon of human rights or free expression or sort of democracy, that nevertheless he was still sort of had a groundswell of support that a lot of Venezuelans supported him. Principally, sort of poor Venezuelans supported him. So I guess my question is, what we're seeing, are the protesters representative of like a majority or a silent majority in Venezuela, or does sort of the Chavez legacy now in the form of Maduro still have that very large base of support? That you're not talking about sort of that there is sort of they do have sort of a legitimate base of support that's not just through their own machinations. What do you think?
Mhm. No, yeah, definitely. The Chavismo in Venezuela has a lot of support, and we've seen some marches in the past days calling for peace by the government that have, they have been attended by a big number of supporters of the government. But they do have to recognize that at least half of the population does not agree with the system, and that can be evidenced by the last presidential elections, where Maduro just won for narrowly 200,000 votes. And with that said, of course, they have a lot of support from popular sectors in the country, as well as middle class sectors and all sectors of the population. I think we are very polarized in all sectors of our society, and there is support as well as there is dissent in the Chavismo, and I think that the system has become a lot more difficult to sustain these days, and the economic crisis in Venezuela has gotten deeper. So I think everybody is feeling the pinch of our economic failures as a country, and that has also sparked a lot of the protests that we are having. Before these political protests that we're seeing here in Venezuela right now, there have been a lot of protests, and most of them have been by pro-government supporters. That they were protesting either, work rights or economic problems, or also living conditions. There's a lot of protests that happen in Venezuela throughout the year. And according to the Observatory of Protest, el Observatorio Venezolano de Conflictividad Social, they would come up with a monthly rate of protests in the country, and many of them were from pro government supporters that were protesting uh, several deficiencies in the system that they were seeing.
So I
Not a
guess,
lot of them were political, so
yeah.
until now.
So I mean, you describe sort of you're saying sort of that there's like this really the economic situation is bad and seems to be only getting worse. And on top of that, you have this seemingly very large and active protest movement. I mean, how sort of serious a challenge to like Chavismo and Maduro do these protesters sort of pose right now?
Well, I don't think, they've been claiming, the government has been claiming that there is a coup in effect. But in order to really do a coup in a country, you need armed forces. It's very difficult to do it with peaceful protests. I don't think they pose a threat in terms of overthrowing the government, but it definitely demonstrates that we do have several problems in the country and that there's a lot of people that are being affected by those problems. The fact that repression has been so brutal in some cases really puts pressure in the government to start a real dialogue with
Hmm.
the opposition.
I wanted to ask you. So Leopoldo Lopez, he was he is the sort of one of the opposition leaders who was jailed. What's his story? Like, what's his background? And I mean, could he, if these protests succeed, and he's let out of jail, sort of could he become sort of the next sort of leader in Venezuela, and sort of who is he?
Well, I don't know if he's always been an opposition leader. He's the leader of Voluntad Popular, which is a political party here in Venezuela. He ran for president or for the candidate to be candidate for the presidency in the primaries that we held in 2012. And then he resigned before that to give his support to Capriles Radonsky, which ultimately became that opposition leader that went against Chavez and then against Maduro last year. So he is known in Venezuela, and he does have a large amount of leadership in the opposition movement. Um, but I don't know what could happen. I'm totally blanked out with knowing what would happen in the future. I don't know if he's going to be released from prison. I don't know if these protests are going to have any effect on that, and I don't know if his leadership will gain momentum just because he was imprisoned in this situation. I do know that he's calling for a more how should I put this? He wants the opposition to take a stance and to keep going to the streets and to keep protesting these uh, these injustices that are happening in our country, um, uh, which is a different type of speech that Capriles Radonsky is putting out, which is more in terms of let's talk about it, let's have some dialogue, let's uh, let's try and solve this democratically and not through through protests as much. Although he also has been, attending these protests and calling for them.
So, are there sort of specific policies that Maduro and sort of the ruling party could undertake that would address some of the demands of the protesters beyond sort of releasing prisoners? Are there sort of specific economic reforms that would maybe pacify them a bit?
Well, yeah. In terms of yesterday was very interesting because yesterday was Maduro called for a peace conference with all sectors of society. The official opposition did not want to go. They've gone to some of these conferences before, and they left a bit ridiculed from the whole situation. They weren't. They didn't think they were being taken seriously. So in this time, they decided not to go. But there were some sectors in society that did go, that do align themselves with the opposition, like Lorenzo Mendoza, which is the owner of the largest corporation in Venezuela. And he spoke in national address during this peace conference that we saw yesterday, calling for a commission for truth to deal with the economic crisis that we're having, where different parts of society would be included in that commission. That was taken with open arms by Maduro. Maduro changed his tone a bit yesterday. He's been talking about peace and dialogue in his other addresses, but it's contrasting with some rhetoric that could seem violent to some people. But yesterday he changed the tone a bit. He even said he's open to more dialogue with the U.S., as Kerry proposed in past days. So there is an inclination to have more dialogue. He specified 3 points for achieving peace in Venezuela. He said, abide the Constitution above anything. No more violence. He wants to neutralize the protests that are blocking streets in certain parts of the country, and defend our country from outside intervention, defend our sovereignty and our homeland. Those are the 3 points.
Right. Wasn't that sort of a nod against the United States?
Well, yes, and against Colombia, because the government has been blaming these protests on the U.S. and on Álvaro Uribe, the former Colombian president.
Why?
I haven't seen yet any like how do you call evidence for this, but that's one of the claims that the government has made.
Well, why Uribe? Just because Uribe is kind of a right winger and Maduro and all are left wingers, it's sort of a convenient villain, or what's the connection?
Yeah, and Álvaro Uribe has been very his comments against the Venezuelan government and the system here have been very strong in the last years. He was a foe of Chavez, although they did agree on some issues. But yeah, basically, it's his right agenda.
And he's saying, "Oh, it's the former president of Colombia is orchestrating." That just seems kind of a little ridiculous. But the sort of the U.S. and Venezuela obviously have been trading barbs for a long time. But most recently this week, was it sort of like maybe 2 weeks ago? The Venezuelan government kicked out some American diplomats, and then I think just this week or last week, the U.S. kicked out some Venezuelan diplomats. I mean, how are these protests sort of affecting Venezuelan-U.S. relationships, to your knowledge?
Well, yes, 3 diplomats have been expelled, and before that, I think it was 2 or also 3 that were expelled a few months back as well. I mean, 8 diplomats have been expelled since 2010, all in all, and since then we haven't had an ambassador here in Venezuela or there in the U.S. The dialogue is strained, the relations are strained, but we're still shipping 40% of our oil production to the U.S. So,
that's not changing.
I don't think that's going to change anytime soon.
How would you put these protests that are happening now in sort of context of the sort of entire sort of Chavismo movement? I mean, the conventional wisdom, I guess, is that, and you can disagree or agree, is that sort of Maduro is kind of pretty much like Chavez, but in terms of policies, but sort of without any of the charisma. I guess, would these protests have happened under Chavez, or would his sort of charisma, would his sort of political acumen have nipped these sort of protests in the bud before they started?
Yeah, well, the thing with Chavez is charisma, as you say, as you point out. I mean, Chavez would give out hour-long speeches and make people laugh and make people cry and make people sing and make people dance. And even if he was saying something that he may not have had evidence for, he made his speech believable. And I think Maduro lacks that believability, if I may say so, in terms of his speech. I don't think he's as believable as Chavez when he claims certain things that he doesn't have proof of. In that sense, I think that has been really critical for his government because that speech was so important for Chavez when he was president. He was
So these protests
omnipresent
could have
in everything.
happened.
You
Yeah.
saw him everywhere, in the radio and TV, and everywhere he was present. So you can see how important his charisma and his speech was in making things believable in this country.
I guess so. So would have, like, so would Chavez have been able to preempt these protests through sort of waving his magic charisma around in like a hour-long speech or whatever sort of venue would Chavez have been able to preempt these protests, do you think?
I don't know. We've been having these same problems for some years now of crime and inflation, but I think we've reached a point where there has to be some changes in the economic system in order to survive in this world. We have annual inflation topping 50%. Some people claim 300%, and the government is burning through the hard currency reserves at a furious pace. So I really don't know if Chavez could have controlled this or not. But I'm sure he would have made a much better attempt.
Can we talk about sort of the issue of crime?
Maduro's doing?
I want to sort of ask you about the sort of issue of crime. I mean, how pervasive is it? I mean, do people just sort of fear for their life or that they're going to get mugged every time they walk into the house? I mean, you've brought up crime and the fear of crime as one of the principal motivating sort of factors of resentment to sort of Maduro and of these protests. So actually, can you describe sort of how bad is the problem?
Yeah, well, I think the National Observatory for Violence calculated that at least 22,000 violent deaths occurred just last year. We are one of the most violent countries in the world, and I think the second or third in Latin America. We do have a big problem with the crime rates here. People are afraid to go out at night. You see that in nightclubs, for example. You don't see them open as much as before. People try and go home early. These days more than ever, of course, because of the protests. But before then, you could notice that there is a fear in society in terms of crime. Everybody knows somebody that has been mugged or even shot at. That is common in our society right now, especially in the bigger cities, but also in the small towns. You've seen crime hike in these parts of Venezuela, and it's a real problem. It's a big problem. It's not only a problem with crime. It's a problem with the judicial system. It's a problem with the penitentiary system. We have prisons here that are governed by the prisoners, where there is no government official that are allowed inside. So when you start seeing these problems that trickle down, it's not only the crime, it's the judicial system, it's the prison systems, it's the security systems that have deficiencies. And those are things that the government has to tackle in order to establish some kind of order in the country. Because what I think that has been leading this country in the past years is anarchy and chaos, in my opinion.
So there's really so like law enforcement is basically non-existent, right? Like so cops patrolling the streets can't be trusted to prevent or deter crime.
Well, a lot of people don't trust certain forces of
And and
security.
I guess is the sort of the crime, the violent crime that you're describing? I mean, is it something that's sort of semi-organized by gangs? Is it sort of just people taking the opportunity to rob someone because they have that opportunity? I guess what is sort of the sort of the big sort of issue?
Mhm. Well, mostly gangs. We do have most of the crime committed in Venezuela is done on motorcycles. Motorcycle gangs have been they have been villainized, truthfully, but it's because of a reason. They've been villainized because a lot of the crime occurs on motorcycles in the country. And some of these gangs are the ones that the opposition is making responsible for the violence in these protests and some of the deaths of students. Um, a lot of the crime occurs uh, on motorcycles and is organized by gangs. There's organized crime and corruption is just skyrocketed in the past years here in Venezuela. So it all contributes.
Is there like a paramilitary element to it where the some of the gangs have connections to the government, though perhaps not formal connections?
Yeah, no, definitely. On Monday, Maduro had a big conference with all the motorcycle gangs in Caracas. Those called tupamaros or collectives, colectivos. These colectivos, they claim they're not armed. They claim they are not violent. But you never know because the thing is that these gangs, especially the ones with connections to the government, they are the first security force in their barrios, in the shanty towns, in the favelas. Um, some policemen cannot go up to these favelas. The only ones that control all the security there are these some of these gangs, and yeah, they're contradictory.
Yes.
They may be very good for the community, but they are also involved in certain things that we can't prove because there's
Mm-hmm.
there's no evidence at the end of the day. Excuse me.
So just I guess in your final few minutes, I know earlier you said you couldn't really predict where this is going because it's sort of so fast moving. But I guess how do you think this might change, if at all, sort of Venezuelan politics?
Well, I would hope that the speech from the government and from the opposition becomes much more inclusive, because what's really dividing our country is how politicians are addressing these problems. When you ask for peace, but then ask to defend the revolution, you're calling for division and violence as well. Um, just as when you say you want dialogue, but you have to keep on doing certain things that might be considered violent to another group. Um, I think that we've come to a point where um, people do not believe anymore in dialogue. They just want results, and that worries me. I don't know how these protests, or if they will continue in the coming days, or if they'll die down. But I am sure that they will not stop completely, because I don't think the conditions are being met for them to be satisfied entirely. So just like I've seen these students stop their protest after we found out that Chavez died on March 5th, and they came out with all the information. These students stopped protesting, but then they came back because the problems, the ground issues that they were claiming were not being met. So even if the protests stop, I think they might continue at another point when something else that's scandalous can occur and may occur in the country.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Oscar. That was really interesting, and I learned a lot, and I'm glad we were able to talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.